Okay, this is your Wednesday night homework. It's your 9-fer. The three outcomes for this 9-fer are fraction operations, integer operations, and isolating variables in algebraic equations. So your first three questions are fraction operations. So your first one says 1 3/5 times 4/7. Now remember, whenever you are multiplying or dividing fractions, the easiest type of fraction to work with is your improper fraction. You don't always have to, but it's definitely easier to do it that way. And even with subtraction of integers, it's easier to work with improper. And if you have to, you could also add with them. So generally speaking, if you ever want to use operations, it's probably easiest to use improper. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite this equation as 8/5 multiplied by 4/7. Okay? And your algorithm for multiplying fractions is you can multiply your numerators and multiply your denominators. But before you do that, you can always check across diagonally. I'll just use a black marker here. Across diagonally, and we can pretend that that 8 was actually above the 7, and then that 4 was above the 5. And we could do what's called cross reduction. But in this case, nothing can be cross reduced, which means I simply have to multiply my numerators and multiply by denominators, and I get 32 over 35, which is lowest terms. That is the answer in lowest terms. There are no factors that 32 and 35 share. In the next question, it says 4 divided by 1 1/3. So for this one, when you have whole numbers, it's easiest to think of it as being 4 over 1 divided by, again, the mixed fraction or improper fraction, which would be 4/3. The algorithm, or the easiest way to solve a division question, is to multiply by the reciprocal, or the flip. In this case, once I have my multiplication, I'll do that cross reduction again. If I look across here, the 4 over 4, if that was a fraction, it could be reduced to 1 over 1. And therefore, when I multiply my numerators and multiply my denominators, I get 3 over 1, which is just the answer, 3. In the third question, we have a quarter plus 3/5 divided by 1 1/8. We have order of operations. So some people think they should get common denominators right away, but the answer is that it works, but it makes it much more cumbersome. The easiest way to do it is to simply, I'm not going to put division yet, or I'm not going to put multiplication yet. I'm going to keep division. I'm going to change this to 9/8, and then my next part would be to change that to multiplication by the reciprocal, which would be multiplying by 8/9. See if you can cross reduce. 3 over 9, yeah, that becomes 1 over 3. And when I multiply that out, I'm going to get 1/4 plus, multiply your numerator, you get 1 times 8, multiply your denominator, you get 5 times, or denominator, you get 5 times 3, 8/15. So our last step is to add 1/4 to 8/15. Now I know 8/15 is just a little bit more than half, so half plus a quarter. My answer should be roughly 3/4. But in order to add them, you need a common denominator. So this is going to be the same thing as my common multiple that both 4 and 15 share. The first one they share is 60. So I multiply this by 15 to get 60. So to create the equivalent fraction, I get 15/16. Multiply this by 4 and this by 4, I get 32. So your answer will be 47/60. 47/60, which is lowest terms. In the fourth one, we have integers. So remember, for the first question, we have two operations. We have subtraction and we have addition. BEDMAS says that if you have just addition and subtraction, you do them in the order they appear from left to right. Some people think because it's A before S in BEDMAS, you do addition first, but that's not true. You do them in the order they appear from left to right. So the first thing I do is the subtraction. I know the easiest way to get the answer is to change it to addition and use the opposite. So 10 negatives and 2 positives would be 8 negatives. And 8 negatives plus 3 more negatives is the final answer of -11. In the second example, I have one operation, I have two operations, I have three operations. So multiplication, addition, and multiplication. I'll do my multiplication first. The product of +5 and -2 is -10. The product of -3 and -2 is +6. So my last step is to simplify my additions. 10 negatives plus 6 positives is 4 negatives. In the next example, I have 6 take away 8 times -3. Now I put that in brackets even though it doesn't have to be. That means do that first, then take your answer and divide it by -2. So the first thing I'm going to do is not the subtraction, but I'm going to do the multiplication. 8 times -3 is -24, so it's going to be 6 take away -24 over -2, which is going to be the same thing as 30 divided by -2. That whole top part is going to simplify to 30. And 30 divided by -2 is going to be a -15. For questions 7, 8, 9, your algebra questions, so remember when isolating variables, meaning getting x by itself on one side of the equation, what you want to keep in mind is you want to get rid of the constant first generally, and the coefficient second. So in this first equation, -5 is my constant, so I'm going to add 5 to both sides. That creates a zero pair. I have -2x equals 8. Keep in mind, what looked like a subtraction symbol can be also inferred as being a negative coefficient. So that -2x is the same thing as a -2x. Therefore, since it's my coefficient, I must divide both sides by -2, and I get x equals -4, because +8 divided by -2 is a -4. In the 8th question, my constant is 1, so I'm going to add 1 to both sides, leaving me with a -1/4 of x equals -2. I'm going to multiply both sides by -4, and x will equal a +8, because -2 times -4 is a +8. And in your last question, you have a question that involves distributive property. There are two ways to solve it. You can either expand using distributive property or divide each side by -10. So really it says -10 groups of x minus 1. So if I have -10 x's and -10 -1's, that means I would have -10 x, and a -10 times a -1 is a +10. That's the tricky part there. Equals -20. So what I've done here is I've expanded using this idea of distributive property. I now have a two-step equation. I'll subtract 10 from both sides. I have -10x equals -30. Divide by my coefficient, and x will equal +3. Okay? So your answer is x equals 3. Now if you wanted to do division first, the way this works is, and it doesn't really make sense when I say -10 groups, but if I had 10 groups of x minus 1, forgetting it's negative, if I had 10 groups of it, then if I divided by 10, I would have what one group is. In this case, I have to divide both sides by -10. Instead of knowing what -10 groups of x minus 1 is, I would know what one group of x minus 1 is, and that would be 2. Then I would simply have a much simpler equation. X would equal 3. The same answer as before, but with a lot less work.